Cursed be the treasure. Part 1. My Father. Chapter 1. The tapping at the window. Looking right back to the days of my childhood, the first beginnings of things are blurred and confused, but I must disentangle them as well as I may if I am to tell my story clearly and coherently. I know now that the story began long before I was born, but I must pick up the thread of it where it first crossed my path. And even that is difficult enough. For before I was conscious to the point of memory, I was already enmeshed in a net of mystery woven long since of dark and incredible things. But to me, they didn't seem dark and incredible, for they were with me before I could reason and distinguish, nor had my experience any touchstone by which to test or measure them. I think perhaps I first began to take conscious stock of my surroundings on a certain night of wind and rain. For earlier events were with me, but as shapeless shadows of memory. But from this night, my life began to unfold before me like a clearly written book. I had been nursed in the atmosphere of mystery, though at this time, of course, such a term would have had no meaning for me, for nothing is strange to the inexperienced. But vaguely I was becoming accustomed to a life of sudden change and hiding and swift flight. My eyes were opening with growing consciousness to a world of passing lights and shadows, with nothing definite or stationary, but all in wavering motion. The one binding and constant element, the thread as it were, which gave single consistency to the whole, was the presence of my father, whose laughter and gaiety, whose thrilling stories of pirates and smugglers and treasure trove, acted rather than narrated with a dramatic realism that left them scored in burning pictures on my imagination, and whose strong and tender companionship to a child of 5 or 6 set him central like the sun in my little world, now growing out of chaos to some semblance of form and individuality. Why this night above all nights should live in my memory as the first clear picture there is perhaps due to the keener suffering I was called upon to endure, or perhaps to the fact that the shadowy pursuer, who kept ever on the road, became this night not merely a name and a fear, but a creature of flesh and blood. The flight in the morning I don't remember distinctly, for that was much as others had been. My father had been playing with me at hide and seek, our favourite pastime, and one always full of thrill and strange romance, when he had crept up to me where I lay hidden, and putting his finger to his lips muttered, "Whist," glancing slowly round with infinite caution. All this I surmise, for it had happened so before, and I knew the procedure well. It meant that the mysterious enemy was on our trail again, and we must be away on the path without delay. "Is it shadow of fear?" I said, creeping close to my father so as to whisper in his ear. He nodded slowly, and looking very serious, took me by the hand, and together we crawled away. It didn't seem in the least fantastic to me, for it had happened often before. It was indeed part of our game, for our hide-and-seek was no garden affair. We needed the whole of England for our playground. So once more we set out on our travels, and I didn't question how it was that everything was ready and in order, our cloaks being hidden in a bush nearby, and my father's knapsack packed for the journey. But on this occasion there was a difference, and it was probably this difference that stamped the affair on my mind. For usually we managed to cover our tracks after a day or two, but this time our pursuer seemed unusually tenacious of the scent, and for days we fled, doubling upon our path, plunging into woods, emerging at high roads where we obtained a lift on a passing cart or wagon, hiding for a day in a remote hamlet, burrowing through the twisting streets of a city, till at last it seemed to me that my whole life had been one long wandering, and I began to grow tired. It needed all my father's fun and exhaustless imagination to keep my heart tuned to the wearying adventure. On the night I speak of, I remember I was crying with fatigue and cold and hunger, dragging at my father's hand as he plodded me remorselessly onward down a drenched and dripping woodland path. His buoyant laugh, usually so exhilarating, failed to shake my drooping spirits into cheerfulness, for indeed I was bitterly miserable. My feet were numbed to solid lumps of aching cold, and the wet twigs that wisped across my face hurt cruelly. Even the hand that my father held was bitter with a throbbing half-consciousness of animation, and the other hung nerveless at my side. so I whimpered and toddled on. But I remember feeling no unkindness towards my father. Not for a moment did my heart cry blame on him. For babe as I was, he had successfully impressed me with the sense of strange pursuit that ever hung upon our flight. It was something entirely beyond his power, something big like fate or death. Tired and miserable, I knew I must on, for behind us there were creatures of the dark scenting stealthily upon our track. I heard their sniffing through the pauses of the wind, and more terrible still their laughter, cackling brutally in our wake. This made me quicken my pace, though it was pain to do so, and clutch my father's hand more tightly in both my own. "Shadow of fear," I would say. "Yes, Tommy, yes," he would answer, "but he's lost the trail this time." Shadow of Fear was the name my father had given to our secret and inexorable enemy. I stumbled on as well as I could through the black wood and the drenching rain, and then I must have slipped, for I found myself swinging from my father's supporting arm. He tried to set me on my feet again, but I felt faint, and the little strength had quite ebbed from my limbs, and my father, with boisterous tenderness, stooped and lifted me onto his back, and with a "Courage, Tommy," strode on with redoubled speed. I hung my dripping arms down his shoulders, taking care not to press them against his throat and hinder his breathing, for I had had experience in this kind of travel. And I laid my streaming cheek upon his head and felt the jogging motion of his walk lull me to a disturbed kind of half-sleep, full of waking visions and drowsy dreams, where great blazing fires and the smell of sizzling and delicious foods mingled with alarms and pattering feet and gripping hands thrust suddenly out of the dark. At last I must have yielded to my fatigue and slept soundly, while the rain beat unheeded upon my face, for I woke to a real fire that fumed up smokily with sputtering crackles and fitful flames, bright enough to show that all around was dark. I couldn't see my father, but I heard him moving behind me, and a sudden light told me that he had lit our travelling lantern, for yellow swinging beams played round our shelter as he hung the lantern from the roof. I looked about me sleepily. Evidently we were in some sort of hut, though where in the whole of England I hadn't the faintest notion. Outside, the wind and rain were still at their old struggle, slashing and crying through the trees in great rushing gusts that grew out of nowhere and raced away again. My father, seeing me move, threw himself down beside me, and stripping off my sodden clothes began to arrange them round the fire. From his knapsack he pulled out a rug, which he had managed to keep reasonably dry through the drenching tempest, and wrapped my naked body in its comforting folds, and the touch of its dry softness was bliss unspeakable after the soaking discomfort of the rain. I smiled up into his face with all my love, and for reward felt his arms about me, and his wet cheek pressed to mine, while he murmured, "That's my brave little boy." So wonderful was my father that words like these were magical, and my ebbing courage flowed again. Then he took my hands between his own and chafed them vigorously back to life, and I don't think I cried at the exquisite pain as the blood flushed slowly back to my white fingertips. And all the time he was talking in his rapid and thrilling way, making a story of the adventure we had passed through, and telling how we had baffled our pursuer at last. I was too weary to pay much heed to his rattling talk. I know that the fire, as it blazed up more strongly and brightly, triumphing over the soaked twigs and branches which my father had scrambled together, thawed my limbs deliciously, and soon I was in a glow of steamy warmth and nodded sleepily, while my father, still chatting in his restless way, prepared some soup. The hot, savoury stuff was the last touch necessary to complete comfort, and forgetting, with the ease of childhood, the dreary tramp through the storm, I gave myself up unresistingly to the luxury of sleep. But my sleep wasn't completely unbroken. It seemed to surge over me like great waves, and whenever I floated up to the surface, I became aware of my father's voice still droning out the story of our flight. He must have been talking to prevent himself from sleeping, for once I seem to remember hearing him muttering, "I must keep awake, I must keep awake." And sometimes when I awoke from my doze, he was pacing the hut or turning the clothes before the fire. I had one longer spell of wakefulness while it was still dark. The wind had dropped, and my father had ceased to prattle. The complete silence, together with the cutting pressure of cold air against my cheek, had probably aroused me more alertly than usual, for of a sudden I felt wide awake. I looked round for my father, but he wasn't in the hut. The lantern was no longer alight, and the fire was smouldering low. The door stood open, and the utter blackness of the woodland seemed banked up against it like a barricade. For a moment the fear of loneliness was upon me, and I would have cried out, but just then my father returned with a bundle of faggots, which he tossed onto the failing fire. There was a smother of smoke and steam, and a loud hissing before the red flames broke through again. "What? Awake, Tommy," said my father, seeing me rub my eyes, which were smarting from the fumes. "Awake, Daddy," I said, blinking up at him with a smile. He shut the door and carefully secured it with a stout piece of timber. I noticed, too, that he had hung his cloak, now dry, over the little solitary pane of glass which was all the hut possessed in the way of a window. "Time to dress, Tommy," he said, helping me pull on my stockings, which were almost toasted by the fire and felt comfortingly warm. I reached for my shirt and breeches and slowly drew them on, my eyes half shut, for I would willingly have lain down again for a further spell of sleep. I pushed my arms into my jacket, and looking round for my cloak, saw it hanging on the wall opposite the door. I was rising to get it when my father said, "Ah, not that just yet. We won't start till morning, but best be ready." He added, "There's a big hole there, Tommy." Keeping out the wind, the cold wind, Tommy, with the sharp white teeth. It's there behind your cloak, all ready to bite. He snapped his teeth and shuddered, while I threw my head on his arm as he sat beside me and chuckled delightedly. For it was always in this way that he spoke of the simplest things, never to frighten, but to give just that touch of dramatic and imaginative charm which childhood thirsts for. And it was this magic spell which he cast over our life of hard wanderings and sudden flights that changed a bitter reality into a wonderful game. He was off again with some story or other, and though I tried to keep awake so as not to miss the precious recital, yet sleep was still heavy in my eyes, and my head nodded. I must have been tired indeed, for my father could tell a story with such thrill and vigour, his expression changing with every phase and mood, that the thing became a living picture. At least it was so to me, and bed had no attraction while I was away with my father, seeking treasure on far-away seas. But this night I missed the better part of the story. I only heard a word here and there. I remember there was a cave, and a conspiracy, and a terrible crime, but how the story went I couldn't follow. And then, in a more wakeful moment, I heard my father saying, "This is how he looked at me." I blinked a sleepy eye up at him and suddenly started into complete consciousness, for used as I was to his extraordinary facial contortions when dramatizing his incidents, I had never seen him wear such a look of frightfulness as he wore now. His hair was standing up stupidly, with one lank lock pulled slantwise across his forehead, almost hiding one eye. His lips, usually so full of laughter, had slipped to a loose and slobbering imbecility. His cheeks were drawn in haggard lines, pulling down the flesh beneath his eyes, which contrasted raw and red with the staring whites. The whole expression was one of blank idiocy, except for a telltale glitter of devilish cunning which lurked in the corners of his upturned eyes. I stared at him in horror. In all his many disguises, I had seen him in nothing that had suggested that his face could be distorted to such a hideous caricature of itself. And yet it was hardly a caricature, for it was all but unrecognizable. I believe that no other eyes but mine could have penetrated that mask. It was only his even voice repeating, "This is how he looked at me," that reassured me somewhat. "But who?" I asked, clutching him. "Who?" "The mad captain. I was telling you, Tommy." "Yes, yes," I said eagerly, hoping to pick up the thread of the story as he continued. My father's face gradually righted itself as he proceeded. "You see, Tommy, he had left them alone there to die, and that was a terrible thing." His voice was hushed and tense in a way I can't describe, but which held me in a spell of expectation. "And he knew they could never get away, and they had no food, and they would starve. And that's a horrible, slow death, Tommy. And if they cried out, no one would hear them. Their voices would be like whispers from the stars. Ah, I said, the treasure, trying to link on to the lost fragment without my father's needing to repeat it, for I knew he hated to return upon his narrative when once well under way. I can see now how necessary it was for him to live in his incident, and repetition spoilt his dramatic flow. So there we sat together, gazing into the red flames, with the night outside very hushed and secret, far away from the world, with somewhere behind us our baffled pursuer scenting along a false track, and my father in his tense and vivid voice telling an old story of crime and madness and remorse. "Yes, treasure, Tommy," he answered me. They were there with the gold and the rubies and the diamonds, trapped in the cave with 20 tons of rock at its mouth, and with nothing to eat, and hunger gnawing like wolves inside them, and no one to hear them crying day after day, and their voices growing weaker and drier, just like croaking birds, Tommy, till one by one they dropped down to die. It must have been terrible all alone there, Tommy. Can't you see them, with bruised, torn hands, beating at the rock, tugging and beating? And the gold lying quiet there, how it must have said to them, "Fools, fools, fools!" And the last man, Tommy, when the rest were all dead. I think he must have gone mad. Can you see him groping from body to body and crying pitifully because they wouldn't move or speak to him, all lying so sad and still and saying not a word? And how he must have sprung away from them and hammered at that rock, and fallen down faint and beaten, and wrung his battered hands, laughing like a madman, pulling at his hair. The last man, all alone, with the treasure and the secret and the dead men, till he grew thin and faint and tired, and lay down with the rest. "And the mad captain?" I asked, thirsting for details. "Ah, he—" And my father's face, which had softened, became rightful again, till for very face I crept closer to him and gripped him convulsively. He went on in his hushed, tense voice. It was like this he looked at me when he told me the story. For you see, Tommy, he could hear the voices calling to him, and if he shut his ears against them, there were terrible curses screaming inside his head, for he knew he had left them there to die. And in the night he saw them there, growing thinner and whiter, and all wasted with hunger. And he counted the days, and said, "Now they must be dead." But still he heard them crying to him. Most terrible and piteous it was. And he knew they were dead and were following him, and he couldn't hide from them anywhere. And sometimes they screamed at him, and sometimes they laughed, a hollow, wicked laughter, he told me, and wondered I couldn't hear it. And then he knew he could never rest again, but must up and away day after day and night after night, with the dead men chasing him and crying to him and mocking his madness. And so he was whipped on from place to place, never resting. For the terrible voices broke into his sleep like a cry of hounds, and the dead faces peered horribly at him through the dark, and the room was always full of moaning and knocking and a shuffling of feet. If I felt frightened at this strange recital in the gloom of our wayside hut, lit fitfully as it was by the red leaping flames of the fire, which threw distorted shadows on the walls which a boy's imagination might work into terrible fantasies, if I felt frightened, it was with a pleasing fear, for I delighted to feel the stirring of unseen things about me, when safe in the comforting security of my father's presence. I remember glancing cautiously around me into the shadowy corners, half hoping to see some white and horrible face gazing out at me, and I strained my ears to catch some echo of the cryings and moanings which my father had been speaking of. The wind had quite dropped, and the night was perfectly still, with a sort of waiting, uneasy stillness, and I thought I could hear a movement in the darkness outside. But my father was continuing. And when he lit his lamp, the blackness through the window was full of beckoning hands, and when he blew the lamp out for very fear, the room was alive with creeping feet. And sometimes he felt cold fingers on his neck, and sometimes breath in his hair, and sometimes— At this moment there was a tapping at the window. My father looked round sharply, and the words died on his lips. He clutched my arm with a hard grip, and I knew my part was to be perfectly still. And then suddenly he let out a bitter cry, and under cover of it had pushed me behind my cloak and through the hole in the wall. The cloak followed, and he hung his own coat in its place, and a moment later the knapsack was bundled after me. I crouched motionless in the cold, with my cloak pulled about my shoulders, and still my father was crooning in a kind of unearthly sob, broken now and again by short little dry chucklings. I summoned courage to widen with my fingers a slit in his coat through which I could peep into the hut. I caught one glimpse of my father's face in the firelight. Again it was drawn with haggard madness, but I thought the cunning in the eye was sharper than before. He was sitting in front of the fire with his knees huddled up to his chin, peering slantwise behind him towards the door. I looked towards the door. The barrier was down. Again there was a tapping at the window. The sound came to me from the outside, and then I heard a low wail. "For the mercy of heaven, let me in, let me in." My father moaned in reply, hugging himself convulsively and finishing on a shriek that broke into a hideous laughter. All this was a new game on me, and curiosity rather than fear was the uppermost feeling in my mind. Indeed, the most frightening thing was the stillness of the woodland behind me. It seemed as though a great hand had the world in its grip, and a loosening of the fingers would set the air into sudden and startling motion. I heard a shuffling at the other side of the hut, and the wall shook as though a body had fallen against it. I looked through the slit in the coat. The door was slowly opening. Chapter 2. Bite in the Dark. What I expected to see I hardly know. I think probably I expected nothing visible, but merely that the hut would suddenly fill with wailings and demoniac cries, for the mad captain with his unseen tormentors was still beating in my mind, and something like a doubt crossed my thoughts that perhaps my father too was fleeing from some such spirits of remorse and retribution. But certainly I wasn't expecting the miserable and decrepit hag who crawled out of the blackness in through the open doorway, delaying on the threshold to push the crazy door flat against the wall before venturing through as though suspecting some hidden snare. It seemed an anticlimax to my strung imagination, and I could have laughed aloud, but something in my father's attitude of stealthy watchfulness held my lips dumb, though I was on the point of pushing back through the wall to say, "How stupid, Daddy," as though a splendid game had been spoilt. For the woman was just an ordinary beggar, very dirty, very ragged, very weary and miserable, and so weak that she must have fallen, and now could only crawl to the comforting welcome of the fire. It was her body I had felt shake the hut as she had collapsed. And yet my father's face didn't change, but his fingers played foolishly together about his throat. He was usually so kind to the friendless and helpless that I expected to see him rise and help her in, and I began to think that I too should like his permission to return to my warm place out of the biting night air that chilled my hands and feet. But his face still wore its imbecile expression, and as the woman crept up to him, he shrank away from her towards my side of the fire, chattering incomprehensibly, and watching her slyly out of the corner of his eyes. His strange manner must have startled her, for she made a circuit to avoid him, but with eyes fixed steadily upon him, still moved slowly towards the fire, till soon they were both crouched one on either side of it, crossing glances through the flames. My father was seated with his back to me, but with his face half averted from the woman so that I could see it in profile. But the woman I had in full view. She was moaning weakly like a dumb creature in pain, and her hands were spread out tremblingly to the fire, as though greedy for its warmth. Her fingers were yellow and thin and withered. She was wearing a kind of bonnet from under which stray wisps of ragged hair straggled down over her face. The bones in her cheeks showed sharply, throwing deep shadows into the hollows behind, and her eyes beneath her great brows were like pits of blackness, occasionally gleaming with points of red as the firelight caught her pupils. And all the time as she warmed herself, trembling and complaining in broken whimpers, she watched my father, who for his part was edging farther and farther from her, jabbering stupidly and gurgling with low, throaty laughter. And so there they sat, like animals in a cage. And although I had never seen anything quite so harmless and commonplace as the forlorn waif who had just crawled into our shelter, yet it seemed to me that the two, as they fronted each other, were like beasts preparing for a spring, and the woman's whine and my father's idiot cacklings were like the growls of coming battle. I became spellbound watching them, wondering what would happen. I forgot the cold, and the immensity of blackness all around me held no hidden fears, for all my mind was on that strange pair in the hut, shining red with the leaping flames and looming black as the fire slackened. This was the best game I had seen, and I was an enthralled spectator eagerly watching for the moves. And, though I knew it not, blacker than the night about me was the shadow of an old crime that had caught me in its darkness and would bring on my head also a measure of doom. It is impossible for me to say just what were my feelings at the time, for the incident has been so often rehearsed by my father with such dramatic distinctness that I hardly remember what I saw through the slit in the coat and what I learnt afterwards. Also, I have come to regard it so much from my father's standpoint rather than from my own, that it is difficult to disentangle my own feelings from his, and in telling what happened, I may seem to be reading more into the affair than I could possibly have comprehended at the time. But this I know, that as the woman spread her hands to the blaze, whimpering curses against the cold and the night and the ill folk that grudged a starving body a bit of warmth, and drove you from their doors without a bite or a sip, I could see her furtively scanning the hut, searching out, as it seemed to me, possible hiding places. Why, I cannot say, but the fear grew in my heart that it was me she was looking for, and as the black hollows where her eyes were hidden rested on the coat behind which I crouched, a shudder passed through me, for I remember how suddenly the fire lit up her eyes in their dark caverns, and the fierce red balls seemed menacingly fixed on me. I shrank back into the night, but not so far that I couldn't still with difficulty see into the hut. And while the woman whined and droned her endless tale of wrong, my father was muttering and chuckling insanely in his corner, puffing out his cheeks, blowing in his hands, sometimes leaning forward and grinning amiably at the old hag, and sometimes snarling malignantly at her, or beating and clutching at imaginary tormentors. But I thought he watched her all the while and took due note of her peering and prying. There was a bundle of straw and leaves and branches and other lumber in the corner behind the woman, and her eyes were often turned to it, wondering, I thought, what it might conceal. I felt a thrill of delight to know that if she thought I was hidden there, she would have a fine disappointment when she looked for me. For look for me, I knew she would, so convinced had I become that she was wondering where I was hidden. For if she was hunting for my father, she must know that I should be with him. And sometimes she gazed at the cloak hung over the window. Perhaps I was there, and sometimes at the coat that concealed my hiding place. But it hung flat against the wall, and she couldn't know of the hole behind it. I triumphed in my security with all the joy that I had learnt from the exciting games of hide-and-seek which I had played with my father. I nearly laughed aloud when the old crone, unable to restrain her curiosity, so it seemed to me, rose shivering, and diving her hands into the pile of lumber, seized an armful of wood and threw it on the fire. She returned to her place, still whimpering, but more angrily than before and with greater vigour. My father only chuckled softly and subsided into snarlings as though the affair hadn't disturbed him. But I knew he had noted it. How it was that with nothing happening, the atmosphere grew more strained with each moment I can't explain. I felt that something was bound to happen, and it would come quickly. I became more and more convinced that the old woman was searching for me. But the knowledge was exhilarating, not frightening. I was used to being hunted and knew the thrill of hiding. And then my father was there to protect me if the game became too serious. And so the droning and the mummery continued, and then the hag, still shivering with cold, rose and twitched down my father's cloak from the window and threw it over her shoulders. Foiled again, I thought, as she crouched back into her place, and my father hissed between his teeth and made a sudden grab at something in the fire. Then his attention became fixed on the roof, though I could see nothing there, and with complete indifference he left his hands singeing in the flames. I could see the hag watching him, and behind her inscrutable eyes she must have been wondering whether this was a supreme bluff or a genuine piece of idiocy. But my father never winced. Slowly it seemed his attention became drawn to his roasting flesh, while I shuddered at the pain of it. But he looked down on his hand and then calmly drew it up to his eyes as though dumbly questioning what had been hurting him. And suddenly he looked across at the woman and with a frightful cry hurled himself at her through the fire. But she was too quick for him, and nimbly avoiding him, slipped round to my side of the fire, still ready to spring away if he attacked her again. And while my father blundered stupidly across the hut and collapsed against the wall, grumbling and shaking, I saw the hag slip a knife back into the folds of her dress. It was real war, I knew then, and my blood sang through my ears. If my father had thought to take her by surprise, he had failed. But still there was no motive for the attack except the rage of a lunatic. If she was questioning his identity, the secret wasn't betrayed. But I began to fear for myself, for I knew she would find some pretext to whip away the coat that was hiding me, and the telltale hole would be revealed. And now she was on my side of the fire. She wouldn't even have to pass my father to get at me. My father must have realized this too, for he seemed to me to be gathering for another spring, and I think the woman knew it and was determined to peep behind the coat before the tables were again reversed. Her hand crept behind her towards me. Instinctively, I clutched at the coat and felt something hard in the pocket. It was my father's pistol, I knew well, a prohibited toy, but one eagerly desired. I had some idea, as a child will, of playing the hero, and I slipped the pistol from the pocket. It was easily done, for the woman's eyes were on my father, though her hand was creeping ever nearer to the coat. I tugged at the hammer of the great thing, and with difficulty cocked it and held it with a shaky hand. And then what happened I couldn't see. My attention was on the pistol, when all at once the hut was in an uproar. I think the woman must have clutched at the coat, and my father sprung at the same moment. At any rate, there was the thud of a body against me, and my hand seemed to be wrenched from my arm, while a splitting roar seemed to burst my head in pieces. I fell back dazed, but rather interested and frightened, and felt my father, stumbling through the dark, trip and almost fall across me, crying, "Tommy! Tommy!" He took me back into the hut and hugged me convulsively when he found me unhurt. The woman lay writhing on the ground with a dreadful dark stain upon her breast. My father's hand was gashed across, and on the floor lay a blood-stained knife. And now my father, from pretense, seemed to become a madman in reality. He laughed and shouted and stamped the floor where the wretched victim lay feebly cursing and spitting blood. His evil joy was terrible, and frightened me even more than the blood-drenched figure at his feet. And then he began heaping the fire into a tremendous blaze and scattering flaming brands against the walls, till at last the crazy structure began to smoulder, and then a sudden sharp flame or two shot up, and all the while he shouted and laughed, cheering on the growing conflagration, till the place was full of choking smoke, and our eyes ran streaming, and the heat scorched our cheeks. And at last he seized me and swung me to his shoulders, and raced away with me through the darkness, now beginning to be touched with grey between the trees. And soon behind us the glare of the burning hut was like a cruel red eye blinking at us out of the blackness. As we pushed free of the woodland into the grey and open morning, my father set me down, and looking back heaved a great sigh and wiped his brow. Then he seized me by the hand and danced me round, repeating excitedly, "We're free, Tommy, we're free." "Was it shadow of fear?" I asked. My father's face darkened. "Shadow of fear never dies," he answered. "But we shall escape him now." And he smiled again. "But that," I said. "Who is that?" "Ah, that," he laughed, "was the old witch, Bite in the dark." Chapter 3. The Dolphin Inn. I suppose it's natural enough that the events of that night should stand out in my memory with vivid distinctness, while the 6 or 7 years that followed have only left a general impression of their progress. I can't possibly say where our wanderings led us, for my father still seemed ill at ease if he lingered too long at one place. But now they became less harassing. We didn't steal away at the dead of night and hide for days in the woods. We journeyed in comfort with horses or by coach and sheltered by the welcome of great inn fires. I remember that this was a time of intensive education for me, not so much in book learning, though my father taught me my letters and was even anxious that I should master Latin, but rather in the arts of hiding, tracking, and every kind of physical prowess. It seems to me now that I had the training of a redskin rather than of an English boy, but I know I entered into it with relish, and pleased my father by my precocious skill in climbing, in fighting with the knife, and especially in swimming and diving. We still kept up our tremendous games of hide and seek, stalking each other across great stretches of country, and even taking refuge on the sea. My father had a power of disguise which was baffling in its completeness, and in hunting him I would frequently ask news of him from some wayside beggar or passing carter, to find afterwards that I had been speaking to my father himself. But I soon found a way of penetrating his disguises, because the scar of the burn and the knife across his left hand betrayed him to me, and I learnt to suspect anyone who hid his left hand or wore gloves. And this betraying mark was disconcerting to him. Not so much, I think, because it discovered him to me, as because he was afraid that it might be a witness against him when he needed concealment. He tried every means to cover the traces of the telltale burn. The gash of the knife wasn't so serious as it lay across the palm and could be hidden by holding the hand half shut, but the scar of the burn spread over the back of his hand and up 3 fingers. He devised stains and dyes and paints, and at last did manage to cover the blemish from all but very curious eyes, but naturally the treatment wasn't permanent, nor could it be applied in a hurry. Generally he wore gloves. I don't know to this day the route of our wanderings. My sense of direction was usually good enough to tell me whether we were travelling north or south, but actually where we were at any particular time I seldom knew, except when we returned to the Dolphin Inn. I knew that through much acquaintance, for however far afield we strayed, we were sure to return to it sooner or later. It was a tumble-down, neglected hostelry that seemed to have known better days. I think its prosperity waned with the suppression of the smugglers, for it lay so remote and in so wild a country that I can't conceive how the patronage of the road alone could have ever maintained it. Indeed, you had to be lost before you could find it. A straggling path led up to it from a rocky shore through a dense patch of woodland, and the only dwellings for miles were a few miserable fishermen's huts and a forest shack or two. But I was always glad to be back there, for the country was an ideal playground for a boy trained as I had been. There was the wonderful flitting life of the woods, secret and passionate, which stirred something deep within me to a yearning sympathy. And then there was the sea with its rocky wall, where the great waves raced and burst, sucking back down the green and clinging weeds to gather strength for a fresh spring. I haunted the wild coast till I thought I knew every bay and reach and pool, and where one could venture at low water, and where the cliffs could be scaled. And my father was pleased beyond measure, and encouraged me in my explorations, greeting me as I scrambled back for a late supper with, "Well, Tommy, what have you found today?" But I never seemed to find what he was sending me in search of, for that there was something hidden on that coast for which he was hunting, I soon began to realize. The night was almost as wonderful as the day, for first came my lesson in fighting with the knife, a time of glorious excitement. In our combats we used folded lengths of paper so that we could fight with vigor but without danger of accidents. What added zest to the game was that my father had promised me a shiny new knife of my own when I had succeeded in hitting him 3 times over the heart. I remember my dancing exultancy when I scored my first success, but after that he became more cautious, and the second blow was more difficult of attainment. And then, when we had finished our combat, came the hour of the evening story. The days at the Dolphin Inn were never long enough for me, and the only time, I think, when I really felt resentment against my father was when he announced that we must be away again. I could see no reason for it. I had begun to understand that once, and long enough ago it seemed to me now, my father had been pursued by some strange and relentless enemy. But I reasoned, wasn't that enemy safely dead? The only answer that I received from my father when I put the question to him was the somewhat enigmatic, "Ghosts, Tommy?" "Ghosts?" I said inquiringly. "Sometimes the dead will rise," he announced in his hushed, mysterious voice. "And sometimes," he added, "the dead will leave the living behind them." All I could gather was that he was vaguely uneasy that the pursuer was still on his track, though there had been no whisper of it for several years. For once, after a long reverie, he suddenly roused himself and, looking keenly at me, said, "Tommy, was he lying still?" I didn't understand and repeated, "Still, Daddy?" He laughed a little, realizing the incomprehensibility of his question, and taking me by the shoulders, he said slowly, "Now think, Tommy. When we left him in the hut, was he lying still?" "He," I said. "You mean she, Daddy?" "Ah, she," he laughed. "The old witch, bite in the dark." Now the picture was very clear in my mind that the old crone was not lying still as we broke away from the blaze, and as my father asked me the question, I could see her, with infinite pain, slowly dragging herself along the floor. My imagination, alarmed probably by the intensity of my father's eagerness, must have exaggerated the impression, for I could almost picture her crawling from the door. But all I said was, "No, Daddy. I saw her move." "Ha!" he exclaimed, turning away, and then swinging round, added impressively, "Tommy, always make sure." "But, Daddy," I cried, "is she still alive? Will she find us?" "No, no, Tommy," he answered easily, patting my head. "She can't be alive. But," he added, "I haven't seen her ghost." I took him to mean that he couldn't be certain of her death till he had seen her disembodied spirit, a theory that seemed by no means fantastic to me, for it was part of my conception of ghosts that they would haunt their murderers. And that closed the subject, except that I was puzzled and disturbed. Firstly, because I didn't quite understand my father's reference to ghosts, and secondly, because he had spoken of the old witch as he. Was he thinking of Shadow of Fear, or was it indeed a man that we had killed? However, we set off again on our wanderings, and I eagerly looked out for signs of the return to the Dolphin Inn, for I loved the place above all others that I knew, and I wanted to find what the secret was which my father was trying to unravel. Now the signs of the return to the Dolphin were two. One was the approach of summer, and the other was that my father would begin to grow a beard. For elsewhere he went clean-shaven, but to the Dolphin he always masked his face in a thick black barbooze growth, which I suppose was his particular disguise for that corner of the world. So when I saw the razor had been laid aside, and my father's face changed from white to blue, and gradually sank concealed beneath a stubbly brush of beard and whisker, I knew we should soon be tramping back to the beloved Dolphin, and I was more excited than usual at the prospect. Perhaps my spirit could scent the coming adventures from afar, or perhaps merely I was beginning to delight in my precocious strength of body, for though barely turned 13, I had the girth of a boy of 15. And with the summer we were there again, and I took up the thread of my life where I had laid it down, initiating what was to be a memorable season by scoring the second stroke of the three that were to win me my knife. We had one room at the Dolphin, up a flight of stairs, and below us was the great kitchen which served as bar for the few odd fishermen who formed almost the only patrons of the inn. Occasionally rougher men from overseas would break the sleepy quiet of the place. Where they hailed from I didn't know, and didn't seek to inquire. They seemed fierce folk, but kindly enough, tossing huge jests at each other, which I didn't understand, but which were always greeted by immense bursts of throaty laughter. We could hear them through the floor of our room if we lay with our ears to the boards, and I remember that whenever they came, my father used to vanish during the day, leaving me to my own devices. Not that I ever saw much of these swarthy strangers, for they came with the morning and vanished with the night. And my father, in that impressive way he knew so well how to employ, warned me to keep well to the windward of them. But once in my ramblings I came face to face with old Dirk Stormaway, whom I had always taken to be the chief of the mysterious band. My first thought was that I had blundered inexcusably, for it was part of my training to scent instinctively the presence of a stranger, and here I had tumbled almost into his arms, not in the least aware of his nearness to me. He thrust out a huge hand and seized me by the shoulder, gazing deep into my eyes with a savage intentness which I returned with interest. "Wool," he drawled slowly, "and who be ye?" Now among the few precepts my father had drilled into me was one never to be disconcerted in an unexpected crisis, and another was to meet danger with a smile. So I answered with a child's impertinence, "Maybe I'm my father's son." He was chewing something mechanically in his mouth, and at my answer he turned his head and spat, and I thought I saw the least of wrinkles pucker the furrows round his eyes. At length, "Yus," he said, "and will you maybe?" And after a pause he added, "And who's your father?" "Maybe," I began, but the light in his eyes hardened and his grip tightened, as though to warn me there was danger in carrying a joke too far. Instinct told me that the answer direct was the safest course now, and I said, "He's the gentleman at the inn." "Heh," was the reply, but the hand still held me, and the chewing didn't stop. "And what's he doing hereabouts, anyway?" was the next question. Now this was disconcerting, for to tell the truth I didn't know, and my father hadn't enlightened me. Also, I began to suspect that under the circumstances the truth might be dangerous knowledge. For that my father was hunting diligently on the trace of some secret I had assumed as a fact by now. And might it not be that the secret was somehow connected with these men? Didn't he always vanish when they appeared? I felt myself shaken, and the eyes were fiercely fixed on me from under the man's savage brows. "Come now, what's he doing hereabouts?" he repeated, adding, "And see here, kiddie, if you don't tell me the truth onto no humbug, I'll crack your back like a stick." His other arm came out, and I felt myself slowly bending in his tremendous hands. "Why?" I cried, again summoning what impudence I could, though I was terribly alarmed by now. "He's a poet. He is." "A what?" cried Dirk. He was evidently taken aback, and I felt my body free again. "He's a poet," I repeated. "He tells stories, writes," I corrected hurriedly. Somehow my own lie seemed suddenly very like the truth to me. For that my father could tell stories as no one else could, I well knew, and that he carried pen and paper with him and a slender selection of books, I also knew. I wondered for half a moment whether I had unawares pitched on the truth. Dirk wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and said with bitter scorn, "Ah, I know the likes of him. Gets the yarns out of chaps like us and dishes them up for the swell blokes. Kah!" he ejaculated with unction. "They don't mind the reading of 'em, but we, what has the doing?" He drew his hand across his throat, and his meaning was unmistakable. At this I felt a surging indignation on my father's account. The man seemed to me to have insulted him, and I said, "You'd better not say that to my father." "Oh," he laughed, "I'd better not, hadn't I?" "And what for no?" Then I realized I had said more than I should have done, and as though I had forgotten my remark, I cried to cover my mistake, "You can't catch me." I ducked under his grabbing hand and was away. Looking back, I saw him spring up to watch me, and then he started on my track, whether in fun or earnest I didn't know. I gave him a good run, that much I remember, making for the rocks where I thought my nimbleness would be to my advantage. But he was up with me too soon, and I was forced to scramble up a tree into the high-top branches where I knew he couldn't follow. But he didn't attempt to pursue. He stood below and shouted at me good-humoredly to come down, and he wouldn't hurt me. I was suspicious at first, but what was I to do? Down I must come at the last. So I put a good face on the matter and slid down at his feet. As it happened, my confidence was well rewarded. He didn't grab at me as I had half expected, but with hands on hips stood grinning down at me, and after a long survey said, "Well, and what else can you do, since you're such a nippian?" "Oh," I cried, "I can swim and dive and I can fight." "Pity if you couldn't," he put in, "seeing as what a world you live in." "I fight with the knife," I said. "The devil you do," he replied. In my belt I carried a wooden knife, which I had whittled myself, and this I drew and rushed in on Dirk to show that my boast was no idle one. But he was too quick for me and seized my wrist in true fashion. At the same moment he drew a cutlass and flourished it glitteringly over my head. I think he was surprised when I sprang and seized his wrist, as my father had taught me, though, of course, he wrenched himself free with a single twist, at the same time releasing my imprisoned arm. Slowly he pushed his weapon back into his belt and said, "Well, you're a smart 'un," nodding his head appraisingly and gazing at me as though pondering some problem. Then he muttered, "Yes, the kid's worth it," and this time, drawing a dagger from his great sea boot, said, "See here, kiddie, I'll show you a trick worth learning." Now, all this while, my conceit had been steadily flattered into arrogance, for a child knows well enough when he is being admired, and it was evident to me that for some reason or other Dirk was pleased and surprised at my prowess, and I was all attention as he explained the maneuver. It was simple enough in theory, but difficult in execution. The idea was to lunge with the right hand, and, as your opponent seized your wrist, to slip your knife into your left hand and drive home. The danger was that it left your enemy's knife hand unguarded, and success was dependent upon swiftness, accuracy, and complete surprise. Dirk demonstrated the trick to me, and for a long while we combated there in the woodland till he thought I had learnt my lesson well enough. And at length, thrusting back his weapon, he gave a glance at the sun, and with a gruff farewell left me. He turned after a few yards and threw back at me, "And if you try to follow me, I'll break your back like a stick." I shouted after him, "I'd knife you first," at which he laughed, but again he turned and said, "And if you tell a soul you've seen me, even that precious father of yours, I'll—" But he didn't finish his threat, for I think he only had one, and he had already used it. He growled and tramped away, but I didn't follow, for the fellow had a way of making you see when he was in earnest and when it was safe to play with him. For my part, I ran back towards the inn, eager to put my new skill into practice and win the knife which I knew my father kept ready for me, for he had shown it to me once to urge on my endeavour, and the vision of the clean blue steel was one which I loved to dwell upon. Chapter 4. EBBTIDECAVE. If I hadn't been so eager, I should have paused long before I did to reflect that I should be most unlikely to find my father at the inn if Dirk and his fellows were in the neighbourhood. For, as I have told you, my father always vanished on these occasions. As it was, the thought came to me, like the sudden arrest of a lasso, drawing me up short almost with a wrench. I stopped, and with the consideration that possibly my father didn't know of their presence, as Dirk's apparition had been a complete surprise to me, I trotted on again a few yards. But I soon came to another halt, this time because it seemed to me somewhat ill-judged to rush home and demand an immediate combat. The unusualness of the thing would make my father suspect some trick, and might put him on his guard. So I turned about, deciding to possess my soul in patience till the evening, when our battle would take place as usual, and then I would have the chance of displaying my newly learnt skill, and perhaps win the wished-for reward. Now I think at this time I had 3 ambitions. The winning of the knife was one, perhaps the chief one. Next to that, I wanted to find some quite new hiding place where even my father wouldn't be able to find me. That he had hiding places out of my knowledge I was only too sadly aware, but so far, as well as I knew the coast and the countryside, I hadn't succeeded in baffling his pursuit. My third great ambition was to find some underground communication between the shore and the woodland. I assumed that such a communication existed, and I explored all the caves and inlets for miles along the coast, but so far without success. There were long caverns eating far into the cliffs, some slippery with seaweed, some above the line of the high tides where the going was fairly easy, but none gave me the passage I was seeking. There were several caves that I particularly suspected of concealing the desired secret. There was one which I named the Dragon's Mouth, for following my father's lead, I gave my own names to all the landmarks of the place, not being satisfied as a rule with the rather unimaginative names which custom had christened them with. This cave I named the Dragon's Mouth, because blocking the opening was one huge rock like the tongue of some colossal monster thrust out through its jaws. I believed that if only the creature would draw in its tongue, I should find the passage of my desires. Then there was Ebb Tide Cave opening into Ebb Tide Pool. I believe this name was of my father's giving. At high tide, the pool, which was well hidden with a wall of rock and invisible from the top of the cliff, which dropped steeply to a level platform and swelled out into a huge overbrowing arch of granite, was open to the sea through a twisting channel where a fair-sized boat might pass, I thought. And many were the dreams I fancied to myself of the coming and going of secret ships. But at low water the channel was closed, and so in stormy weather Ebb Tide Pool was an ideal bathing place. At high tide the cave was also in deep water, but dry, or nearly so, at low tide. But the baffling puzzle of the cave was that it stopped abruptly after some 20 yards, blankly walled with two great flattish rocks which looked for all the world like the two halves of a huge gate. And many a day I spent searching for the secret of their opening, but never with any hint of success. There were other inlets, too, that I tested and examined, particularly the few short tunnels that gave onto a sandy bay to the east of Ebb Tide Pool. It was here that the fishermen launched their smacks, and a hut or two clung crazily to nooks in the sloping cliffs. At the farther horn of the bay was a dilapidated jetty built originally of stone, but roughly repaired where the seas had breached it with makeshift piles and planking, themselves unsteady and decayed. It was only seldom that the fishermen used it, but I delighted in picturing to myself wild scenes of its desperate history when the smugglers were still a power on that coast. However, I discovered nothing in the bay. I searched east and west, and though at times I thought I had come upon a further clue, yet it never led to anything. And again I returned to the Dragon's Mouth and Ebb Tide Cave, which seemed to me the most dumbly obstinate in refusing to yield their secrets. This day, having nothing better to do, I set off for Ebb Tide Pool for a clamour and a bathe till it should be time to return to the inn. I didn't go by the directest route, for true to my father's training, I made a business of my play just as he made a game of all my education. Indeed, work and play were one thing to me. For if we decided to climb Dead Man's Drop or cross the Suckfoot Marshes, the expedition was always undertaken with some imaginary purpose in view. There was a message to be delivered, or a sentry to be surprised, and usually we were ranged against each other, one being set to hinder the other, and the fun of the game wasn't merely in the climbing, or whatever it might be, but in evading the hidden enemy. So when left to myself, I always devised some fanciful story to give a colour to my play. The result was that I scarcely ever made a direct journey, but always skirted this and rounded that to make believe I was outwitting my foes. On this day I didn't wander very far from the path, but my route was somewhat roundabout, and on a sudden I came to an abrupt halt, listening intently, for once already I had been taken unawares, and I wasn't intending to be caught again. I had heard a crackling in the woods. I was distinctly alarmed to see Dirk Stormaway stepping at right angles across my path, for I knew if he should see me, he would believe I had been tracking him. Accordingly, I squeezed up against a tree and waited for him to go by. He passed behind a thick clump of thorn, but didn't reappear. I listened for his step and watched for him, but there was no sign of him anywhere. I was just going to move on, when again there was the sound of steps, and once more I grew onto my protecting tree. I was amazed to see my father following stealthily on the trail of Dirk, and he too vanished. Then it occurred to me that it was round here that my father always managed to baffle my search whenever he hid from me. I had tracked his lair to within 100 yards or so, but never to its exact goal. However, I thought this was no time for further investigation. The air was tense with alarm for me, and I felt a pang of doubt on my father's account. If Dirk should catch him following, I thought he would either break his back like a stick or put that famous knife trick of his into practice. But I was used to strangeness and mystery, and the idea of hunting and being hunted was familiar to me from as far back as I could remember. So I easily shook off the impression of alarm that had crept over me, and skirting away from the point of danger, I was soon stripping for a dive in the pool. The afternoon was beautiful, with a blazing sun, and I was in and out of the water, practicing all my strokes and tricks. For some hours, for evening was drawing on before I dried myself for the last time by jumping up and down in the sun and pulled on my clothes. The tide had been coming in and was now almost full. With one last look at the tempting depths, wondering whether I should strip again for a final plunge, I turned and set off up the cliff. Some day, I vowed, I would negotiate that huge frowning brow of rock that overhung the pool, for at present, if I wanted to reach the level platform above it, an ideal spot for a boy to sprawl on and send his dreams out over the sea, I had to scramble down from the top of the cliff, and in climbing up from below, I had to be content with a longer trail to the left. I had taken only a few steps when I heard a gruff voice beneath me chanting an old sea song, and with instinctive caution I ducked behind a boulder as I saw the nose of a boat pushing out from Ebb Tide Cave. I rubbed my eyes twice to clear my sight when I saw that in the boat was none other than Dirk himself. But there was no mistaking him, and he knew his way too, for he steered straight for the outlet of the pool, and I watched him pass easily through the choppy waves, guiding himself with his oars, and out through the twisting channel, where rounding a headland of rock he disappeared. I now knew that my suspicion of those closed gates in the cave was justly founded, yet until this moment I didn't realize how little I had credited my own childish theories, for the revelation came to me not as a thing long expected, but with a shock of surprise. My thought now was to descend again and investigate, but I think I must have been getting frightened and unnerved by the adventures of the day, for somehow the idea of returning to the cave and finding the gates closed against me, though knowing full well that Dirk had just passed through them, jarred unpleasantly on my imagination. And suppose they were not closed, suppose they were open, I should be confronted by the dead blackness of the unknown beyond. I shuddered and turned away, wondering at my ebbing courage, for it wasn't usual for me to turn heartsick at the prospect of adventure. But I was still a child, and I was probably tired, and had certainly had my fill of surprises for one day. Not till I was nearly at the top of the cliff did I remember my father, who must have been following Dirk. Perhaps if I had descended again I should have met him and learnt the secret from him. Again I hung irresolute, but I reasoned that by now he would no longer be there. Also, I was feeling weary, and told myself that I must be fresh for the combat in the evening if I were to bring off my little maneuver successfully and win the knife. My father was already in, doctoring up his scarred hand, when I arrived. As usual, he greeted me with, "Found anything today, Tommy?" I could have answered volumes to that question, but reserve was part of my training, and I wanted to use my new knowledge before I divulged it. So I only answered, "Had a lovely day," and reaching up, put my arms around his neck and kissed him. But in his eyes, as I searched them, I saw no trace of excitement to show that he had been spending his time otherwise than usual. Supper was brought to us, and after supper we cleared the room for battle, but I didn't win the knife. To tell the truth, I felt rather stupid and asleep, and for the life of me couldn't bring myself to try Dirk's trick. I realized, too, that it might be easy enough in practice, but in a real fight it would be another matter. A slip would put you at the complete mercy of your antagonist. It was a reserve maneuver to be kept as a last resort when the choice lay between a desperate risk and a certain defeat. My father saw that I was tired and soon cried enough, and then settling down in the waning twilight, he put the final touches to his hand, and commencing to yarn, bore me away with him on the magical stream of his story over wonderful seas. The hour of the evening story was always a golden time for me, for my father didn't merely stuff me with thrill. Looking back, I can realize now how artistic in conception and narration were those extraordinary yarns of his, gleaned from every imaginable type of old sea dog with whom he had rubbed shoulders, and vivified with all the charm of his abundant imagination. Sometimes he would set me to tell the story, but in his presence I was tongue-tied and stumbling in my speech. But I know that I learnt from him, and not from any pedagogue, whatever understanding and appreciation I have of the splendor of language. And so, with the last of the light to bed, while my father drew a heavy screen around his little reading table and, lighting his lamp, applied himself to the mystery, whatever it might be, which engaged him night by night. All I ever heard was the scratching of his quill, or more usually the turning of pages. He was still behind the screen when I awoke with the question on my lips. "Are you a poet, Daddy?" I think he was surprised, for he exclaimed quickly, "A poet, Tommy?" And I heard a faint sigh. Then he laughed and said, "You've been dreaming, Tommy. Better go to sleep again." Chapter 5. The Closed Gate. My father always tried to meet a surprise with calm acceptance, as though it was a thing which he had been anticipating. This was part of his technique of philosophy, as he termed it, though the phrase was sufficiently incomprehensible to me as a boy. So when, the next morning, I tracked him right into his hiding place, pushing under the bushes and finding the hole which led down into the secret passage, he didn't exclaim his astonishment, but hearing me stumbling my way through the unexplored blackness, he opened the shutter of the dark lantern he was carrying and said in a matter-of-fact voice, "Come along, Tommy. I'll show you." It was I who was taken aback, for he had been hidden from me, and the sudden light surprised me. I uttered a feeble "Oh," and took his hand. The passage was wide enough for two, and high enough for a short man like my father to walk upright in. The lantern lit up at intervals the stays and beams which supported the tunnel, showing it to be a man-made affair. Presently we came to a flight of roughly levelled steps built up with stakes into the earth, and at the end there was a steep drop into darkness, with a rope ladder disappearing into the gulf. My father began to descend, and I followed. It was a longish shaft, and I was glad to reach the bottom. I knew at once that we were in a different sort of place now, for the sound of our feet echoed resonantly, and the walls were running with moisture, and there were no supports along the sides. As we proceeded, the tunnel gradually widened, twisting its way downward at a gentle slope, and after a while the floor became slippery with seaweed, showing that the tide flowed in at full. In fact, before we had reached the end of the journey, we were wading in water up to our knees, for it was still fairly early, about 9 or 10, and the tide was only at half ebb. And then my father set his lantern in a niche high up in the wall and said, "Well, what do you make of it, Tommy?" I looked about me in the dim light, and before me stood a flat wall of rock, split in two, which I recognized at once as the back of the gateway that opened into Ebb Tide Cave, though whether I should have recognized it so quickly if it hadn't been for my observations of the day before, I don't know. I said with something of my father's nonchalance, "This opens into Ebb Tide Pool." Even my father couldn't quite screen his surprise, for he wasn't to know how I had arrived at my knowledge. "Ha!" he exclaimed. "You're very cute, Tommy." "But look," I said, and pointed to the twin doors of rock. "But how do you know it opens?" he asked. "I know," I said. "But how?" "It must do," I said doggedly, for I couldn't tell him how I knew. "Yes, it does," he said at length, "but I haven't found out how it's done." We didn't find out that morning either, though we probed every nook and cranny, questing for the secret bolt or spring or whatever it might be which would set that great gate swinging. My father had been over the whole ground before, and I found nothing new to solve the mystery. I thought I had made a discovery when, scrambling up to the niche where my father had set the lantern, I found I could thrust my arm deep into a cranny full of rotting refuse. I cleared it away, but couldn't reach to the end of the little crevice. I pointed it out to my father, but he had explored it before without result. We came away at last, and emerging into the bracken, blinked at the blinding daylight. "That's that," said my father, and warned me not to prowl there too often. But I knew what I meant to do. For the rest of the day I reserved my strength, knowing I had been too tired the evening before to do myself justice with the knife. So I lay out on the cliff and bathed in the glorious sun that still beat splendidly from the blue, and before returning I tumbled into the sea for a single plunge, and reached the inn with a magnificent appetite and feeling fit for the evening's encounter. To describe the combat in all its details would take too much space, for it was long and eventful. I tried every artifice my father had taught me, hoping to make my drive without betraying my secret, but he held me in play too surely, and though I managed to parry his attacks, I scored no hits myself. As we drew apart for a rest, both panting from the exertion, he asked, "Had enough, Tommy?" And I answered carelessly, "No, I'm fit for another turn," and we closed again. I ran in quickly this time, intending to put the trick into immediate play. As I expected, he shot out his left hand and caught my wrist, and I saw the word rash forming on his lips. But before it was uttered, I slipped the knife into my left hand and with a sideways jab crushed the paper weapon against his breast, feeling my hand go thump against his ribs as though I had struck him. "Well," he exclaimed, and dropped his own weapon to the floor. "Well," he sat down. "I have seen it done, Tommy. But where did you learn it?" I evaded the answer by dancing about him and exclaiming, "The knife! The knife! I've won the knife." "And you shall have it," he said. And so, at last, the shining prize lay in my hand, and with fond fingers I felt along its delicious edge. When should I need to use it in earnest, I wondered. I turned a radiant face to my father, and throwing an arm round him, I kissed him vigorously, and drawing away said, "If I ever meet Shadow of Fear, or the old witch, bite in the dark." I didn't need to finish the sentence, but slipping the knife from my upraised right hand into my left, I practiced the feint in mid-air. My father smiled and said, "Don't be satisfied yet, Tommy. You're not a man till you can use a pistol, too." In honor of the occasion, he told me a wonderful tale that night, and I sat at his feet long after the sun had gone down, and the window had become a black square, and the strange voices of the night were ominous of dark and secret things, listening to my father as he told a story of desperate smuggling and battles and arrests and rescues. The story, I remember, was particularly vivid because it was set locally, and all the caves and creeks I knew, and the old tumble-down jetty became alive with savage men. And especially I remember how the gate at Ebb Tide Cave gave up its secret, swinging away from the wall and leaving revealed a passage into the cliff. And one cruel incident dwelt in my memory for many a day because of my father's vivid description. It was an old smuggler's vengeance on a traitor, the wretched victim being torn asunder between earth and sea, with a rope around him from a cave roof, and a heavy log tied to his feet and floating on the water, weighing him down to a lingering death as the tide slowly ebbed. When at last I crept into bed, it was a real comfort to me to slip the knife under my pillow, for the tale had been unusually stirring, and my mind was in a strange confusion. More than once I awoke startled and felt swiftly under the pillow for the reassuring touch of my newly won friend, for it may have been the effect of my father's story, or it may have been an uneasy premonition of coming things, but I seemed to hear a sort of stifled shuffling through the house, and knockings and smothered voices, and the trees outside shook unsettled branches, and a swaying bough kept brushing furtively across the pane. Once I awoke with a greater start than ever, and sat bolt upright listening intently, every nerve strained and alert. It was unmistakable. There was something creeping in the room. For a moment I thought a hand touched my neck, but it was only my hair stiffening. I took control of myself, though my heart thumped deafeningly, and quietly reached a hand out for my father. He wasn't there. At this, I think I broke down and cried terribly, "Dad! Dad! Where are you?" "Hi, Tommy. What?" he answered quickly, and was at my side. "Oh, Daddy," I said, trying to hold back my tears. I was frightened. "Why, you have your knife," he tried to pacify me. "But where were you?" I asked. "Why?" he answered easily. "I must have fallen asleep in my chair." It wasn't till morning that I remembered I had already felt him in bed beside me. Waking with that thought in the grey dawn, I told myself he had been listening through the floor. Chapter 6. The King's Man. I sprang out of bed, feeling very much ashamed of myself for my stupid terror of the night. Daylight makes our fears seem so foolish that we wonder how we could ever have been afraid. My head was still a little dizzy and uncertain, so I scrambled into my clothes and ran downstairs and into the yard for a cooling drench under the pump. I was longer than usual, for as a rule I wasn't too attentive to this part of my toilet. But this morning there was a clinging vapory hotness about my brow which wouldn't be readily washed away. When at length, refreshened, and doubtless with rosy cheeks and dishevelled hair, I broke back into the kitchen, I stopped short in sudden consternation to find it full of men. I at once recognized them as Dirk's fellows, but a quick glance round showed me that Dirk himself wasn't there. Now I had always thought of these rough strangers as pirates, not in the least doing them disparagement in my thoughts on that account, rather in my imagination framing them romantically in adventures on far seas. But something, I suppose, of last night's story was still beating in my head, and forgetting utterly my father's warning to steer clear of these men, I was seized by a stupid madness and unwittingly blurted out, "The smugglers!" I was dumbfounded as soon as the words were out of my mouth, for there was a sudden stillness in the room. Talk stopped, cannikins were arrested halfway to the lips, and every eye was ferociously bent on me in a sort of savage questioning. Then one fierce fellow strode up to me, and taking me by the shoulders said, "Doest mind repeating that there?" But I had no word to say, and only looked up at him blankly, and shook my head. He dug his fingers into my flesh, and spoke more harshly, "Come now, who's been telling ye they tales?" I had it in my head to explain how I had merely fitted the fellows into my father's stories, and I began fatally, as though in answer to his question, "My father." But he broke in with, "Thy father, eh?" "No, no, no," I cried in dismay, but a general burst of oaths drowned my protest. A discussion was raging fiercely, but I could make little of its drift. I only caught such expressions as, "I told thee now," and someone answering, "That's that's the cove." More ominously sounded the grating whisper of one harsh voice, "The king's man, freeze un," and again I heard the same voice muttering, "Spy." How all this applied to my father I couldn't guess, but I had sense enough to realize that he was in danger, and my part was to warn him. A jerk away from my captor only set me in firmer imprisonment, with a kick on my shin to put me on my best behavior. I began to be frightened. Soon they had me in the midst of them, and their menacing bloodshot eyes terrified me more than the fists they held to my face. I was cowed by their brutality, and gave no thought even to the precious knife in my belt. I must have whimpered, for someone caught me a buffet across the face and said, "Here, stop they waterworks, and speak to what thou'rt bid." And then came a question to which probably only my blubbering saved me from betraying the true answer. For a voice was saying in a husky attempt at a whisper, "Thy father, him be the cove with the burn across his hand, eh?" The question startled me, and I heaved out a further burst of tears to cover my confusion. "Here, hearken," I was bidden again in the same grating tones, "and Gord help 'ee if thee don't speak up true. Be thy father the cove with the burn across his hand?" "Left hand," somebody added. I raised my face, biting at my lips to check my tears, and shook my head as foolishly as I could to express my utter failure to comprehend. In my mind, bewildered as I was busily wondering how to warn my father. I felt thankful when I remembered it was only a few days ago that he had last treated his scar, and it would still be invisible to these men even if they caught him and examined him. I had no thought to spare for the mystery which had set them on his track by this telltale sign. So when the question was repeated to me, instead of shaking my head, I stamped my foot in childish petulance and shouted, so that my father, if he were listening above us, might hear, "Burn! Haven't I said there's no burn? Fools!" I was caught a sounding cuff for my pains and sent reeling, and as a hand gripped me, I cowered, expecting the blow to be repeated, but my heart gave a strange jump of relief as I heard Dirk's voice above me. He had entered the kitchen and was cursing volubly. When his oaths were exhausted, he thundered, "What the blazes are you doing with the kid, anyway?" Explanations broke out confusedly, but he cut them short with, "Stow your gab, the lot of you!" And when the room was silent, he turned to the ruffian who had first seized me and demanded, "Speak up, Davy. What's it about? Davy explained, and Dirk glowered at me darkly and said, So that's it, eh? Told you we were smugglers, eh? No, I cried. No. Yarns. That's all. I told you. But his great hand came slapping over my mouth, and I felt my shoulder severely wrenched. I had nearly betrayed our earlier meeting. Ah, Dirk took me up sarcastically. He tells yarns, does he? One of these poetical chaps, I reckon. Heard of poetical license, come to think of it. Seems like a case of it. Well, he ended unexpectedly, we are smugglers. Now how do you like it? Really? I cried with such genuine admiration that there was a general guffaw, and all at once the strained atmosphere was wonderfully relieved. Yes, really, said Dirk. Have a good look at us. Handsome lot, aren't we? And if you ever write one of them yarns like what your dad does, we'll put us all in, and we'll take it kindly of you, and hang us all at the end for warnings like, same as they done to Jem and Roger last year. Poor devils. The grins changed to oaths at the mention of Jem and Roger, and Dirk's face became hard. But just then my father was heard running down the stairs, singing gaily to himself, and every form froze in rigid expectation. He was singing a song I delighted in, but I was appalled to hear it now. Dance to your daddy, my little laddie. Dance to your daddy, my little man. He had got so far when he swung open the door and stopped short with well-feigned surprise to see the kitchen crowded with silent men, all with eyes fixed intently upon him. His hands were in his pockets, and I knew how those eyes were waiting for them to be withdrawn. Company! Splendid! Cried my father, and called for the mugs to be filled, and then catching sight of me still struggling against my tears. Why, what's this, Tommy? He said, and laid his hands upon my shoulders, holding me out at arm's length. Nothing, Daddy, nothing, I answered, smiling back as well as I might. But I knew that both his thought and mine was that his hands were free to the view of all. For a half-moment the silence seemed to freeze in the air. Then there was a low muttering, and voices broke out again. They had looked their fill, and had seen nothing. My father gave me a little push to hint to me my course, and I slipped from the room while the business of drinking was resumed, and before I left the inn I heard bursts of laughter, and my father's voice raised above the rest. I understood well enough that he had made all easy there, and was regaling the company with his racy chaff. I made for Ebb Tide Pool, intending to hide before the smugglers should be back there. I meant to learn the secret of the gate this day. It was still early morning, and the tide was coming in. There might just be keel way for a boat, I thought, to steer in through the channel. If I were quick, I might be in time to see a boat enter or row away, so I made no circuits in my route this day, but took the shortest path I knew. But I did throw one sop to make believe, carrying my knife in my mouth, and the result was, clambering down the cliff with too little regard to safe footing, I slipped on a rock just above the pool, and being child enough to exclaim at the slight twist it gave to my ankle, the knife fell from my mouth, and I watched it strike on a ledge and splash into the water. I knew it was deep where the knife had fallen, and quickly slipping off my clothes, I dived in to recover it. I thought it would be an easy matter, but 3 times I rose unsuccessfully to the surface. I crawled out to regain my breath, and noticed that the current had carried me away from the spot, close in to the very edge of the cliff. I reasoned that that explained my failure, and when my breath was sufficiently restored, I plunged in again, but this time farther out to allow for drift. Even so, I had to grope along the bottom of the pool till my breath was nearly exhausted before my hand touched the knife, buried in the sand almost up to the hilt. I tugged it free and made for the surface, but the water grew strangely dark around me, and my head came crack against a rock. I struggled desperately, for my lungs were bursting, but I seemed to be imprisoned beneath an immovable roof. I tried to reason out my position, how I had come there, and which was the right way to turn. I remembered how the current had carried me towards the cliff, and in a dim, distracted sort of way knew quite well that all I had to do was to push out and up. But though I knew quite well what to do, an unreasonable panic had control of my limbs, and I kicked and beat frenziedly against my prison, while a voice seemed to be saying to me from far away, "Keep cool, Tommy. Always keep cool." I was in an agony, knowing myself in the grip of a stupid terror, when deliverance lay in calmness. But I couldn't shake off the terror, and my temples were hammering and my ears throbbing. And suddenly there seemed to be only water about me again, and lashing out with arms and legs, I found myself at the surface, gulping in the air with great choking sobs. Mechanically, I trod water till I could regain my breath, and only gradually it dawned upon me that it was strange that all about me should be pitch dark. I rubbed the water out of my eyes. I tried to remember whether I had been bathing at night time, for I was still confused. Then, growing a little clearer in mind, I told myself it was the blood that had rushed to my head, and I should soon be able to see again. But still, everything was dark around me, and the realization that it actually was so came like a shock. Where was I? As I grew calmer, a certain interest mingled with my fear. I peered around and dimly became aware of a faint green glow along the water. I began to swim about to find into what strange place I had stumbled, but the water seemed half choked with drift and refuse, and going wasn't easy. Weeds clung about my legs, sucking hatefully to my flesh, creeping like fingers furtively feeling along my naked body. The water seemed to be alive with slimy things reaching their tendrils hungrily out of the dark. If I moved slowly, they slid about my throat, and if I splashed my way through, they gripped viciously about my arms and feet. And all the while the green glow intensified along the water, and the floating things showed up vaguely luminous through the dark. It was with a gush of relief that at last I felt the bottom, and with a spasm of fear scrambled out of the infested pool, shuddering at the thought of what horrors lay concealed there. For my mind was full of stories I had heard of the devilfish and other slow and evil monsters of the caves. For a while I could do nothing but hug myself into as small a space as possible, trembling and chattering with fright, my eyes intent upon the green and glowing water, expecting momently some clutching tentacle to rise and seize me. How long I should have remained so I don't know, for I was completely unstrung and had no power to move a finger to help myself, and the startled scurrying of creatures about my back and feet added to my horror. But my fear was lifted from me by a sound that might have added to it. I heard voices, and voices in that dark underworld, which seemed to have shut me right away from the light and air, were like a reassurance that I wasn't hopelessly entombed. I began to listen, but could only make out a low, indistinguishable droning which I couldn't locate. But the effort to locate it nerved me again, and I took control of myself and began to grope through the darkness towards the sound. I slipped often enough, but the voices became louder, and presently I noticed a wavering patch of yellow light against the green iridescence of the cavern. I made towards it, and I think it wasn't till this moment that I became aware by a cramp in my hand that all the while I had been tenaciously clinging to my knife. I was cheered to think that in the struggle under water and the scramble in the cave I hadn't dropped it. Soon the light was over my head, and after a trial or two I succeeded in climbing to a secure perch where I could examine it. But putting up my face, I was dazzled by the full glare of a lantern in my eyes, which had by now grown so used to the darkness that the phosphorescent glow of the rotting drift about me was bright enough to show me the rough outline of the rocks. I hastily withdrew my face from the light of the lantern, which was shining through a crevice in the wall of the cave, and then, like a blurred picture focusing to clearness, everything took shape and coherence in my mind, and I knew exactly where I was. The lantern was standing where my father had placed it the day before when he had taken me down the secret passage, and together we had examined the great closed doors. The crevice was the one through which I had thrust my hand, clearing it of its rubbish, so that now the lantern could shine right through. But now I was on the other side. Somehow I had dived under the submarine mouth of this cavern, never suspecting its existence. Quickly the thought flashed through my head that now I had found the hiding place I wanted, but the thought melted as quickly as it came, for I had other matter on hand. For through the cranny I could hear the voices speaking distinctly enough to make out what they were saying. though of course I couldn't see anything as the lantern glared full into my face if I attempted to look into the passage beyond. And what I heard soon began to have an interest for me. There were two men, it seemed, and I assumed they were in their boat, probably on guard, for the tide was rising to the full now, and the cave must have been deep in water. I couldn't catch all they were saying, but when I heard the words, "cut across his hand," I strained my ears to the uttermost. "Yus," was the reply. "And a burn too, warn't it?" "Aye, and a brat with un, they do say." "Well, I suppose they'll nab un all right." "Hope so. Must have been he what let Jem and Roger into the trap last year." "Ah, well, Dirk'll see to un. If he bean't too cute, he'll need be if he can hide they tracks." There was a short pause, and the last speaker began again. "But how did Dirk get wind of it?" "Wind of what?" "Why, the burn, and the brat, and that." "Dunno quite. Someone let on, I suppose. Someone what was nabbed, I just say, and found un out when it was too late. Got word through, I expect. Dirk's sharp." What happened next, it was impossible for me to know at the time. The voices had stopped, and I was worrying the problem how my father could have become mixed up in all this business. It was clear to me that he was suspected of being a king's man and spying on the smugglers to betray them. I don't believe I gave a thought to whether he were guilty of the charge or no. The thing that puzzled me was how the burn and the scar and even my presence came into the affair, for these seemed part of another episode altogether. But at any rate my meditations were cut short by a tremendous uproar from the smuggler's cave. There were cries and curses and commands, and the sound of scuffling and splashing, and the lantern was dashed from its place, and through the crevice I saw the light of day. I guessed the gates had been opened, and then there was tumult inconceivable, the volleying of pistols, screams and curses, all echoing in a resounding roar up the rocky corridor. And, after a little, peace. I was dazed and stupefied. I strained my eyes to see through the cranny, but could distinguish nothing to tell me what had happened. And then again, from the distance, very far away as it seemed to me buried there, came the faint echo of a further fight. But beyond the fact that there had been a fight of some kind, I could guess nothing. I waited a long time listening, but all was still again, and the stillness began to press upon me like the dread of some unknown danger. I remembered my strange position, and something of my first fear returned upon me. I was alone, cut off as it seemed in the quietness of the cave from the world I knew. It was dark about me with only a greenish glow to show me the shadowy forms of things. And everything I touched was damp and slippery, and the water smooth and secret and laid over with a luminous green slime. And the thought came to me with a sickening shudder that to escape I must dive again into that putrid pool through the clinging weeds and the thousand horrible things which I felt were lurking for me there. And then I knew I was cold and shivered. I couldn't face it. I stumbled along the slippery edge of the water, searching desperately for some other outlet, but I only seemed to be plunging into deeper darkness, and wherever I trod, the crabs scurried away beneath my feet. Then, looking back, I could no longer see the one gleam of light that bound me to the outside world. At that, I was thoroughly terrified, and turning on my tracks, I hurried, slipping back along the water's edge, till once more I saw the faint gleam above me and felt cheered. So I sat down for a minute or two to get a grip of my courage and told myself over and over that I was a coward. The lesson of the night before came into my mind, and I knew that it was merely a baseless fear of the dark that possessed me, but the knowledge didn't strengthen me. I sat shaking, my teeth chattering in my head. To dive into that greenness seemed beyond my power. I saw myself struggling in the dark, choked beneath the water, entombed. And all at once, I don't know why, I rose and plunged, and in my eyes the water grew radiant again, and I was puffing safely in ebb-tide pool. I swam for the shore and warmed myself in the sun, blinking at the unaccustomed light, and telling myself, as I had done in the morning, that I was a fool to be afraid of nothing. And then I realized that the only way to prove my courage and recover my lost self-esteem was to dive back to the cave and out again, till I knew the way by heart and had familiarized it from all terrors. But the thought of returning there wasn't pleasant, and it was only a sudden resolution like the one that had brought me safely to the light again that sent me diving back into the darkness. Yet once there, something of my fear revived, and hardly waiting to draw breath, I was under and out again. I told myself that was enough, and so climbed up to my clothes, intending to dress and investigate the meaning of the recent battle. I had just slipped my shirt over my head when there was a shout above me, and stones and earth came tumbling down the cliff. Looking up, I saw 3 men struggling, and one of them, breaking free, tottered and came sprawling over the edge. The other 2 followed with more caution. They were in red uniform, and the man they were chasing was Dirk. He recovered his footing and came bounding down towards me. I was quick enough to take in the situation. The smugglers had been surprised by the runners, and here was Dirk making his last dash for freedom. So swift a thing is thought that I had time to remember the talk in the cave about the king's man. Had someone betrayed them? Had my father— "Dirk!" I cried to him, though taking care to screen myself from the runners who were still far above. "Dirk, come!" "Off, kid!" he shouted. "I'll show you," I said. But I could never have stopped him if he hadn't slipped and fallen. He lay grasping his ankle and rocking himself in an agony. "I'm done!" he moaned. "Done!" "There's a cave," I said. "I know, kid," he growled. "And they know—" "You don't know," I insisted. "And they don't know. I was there all the time." The runners, sure of their prize, were taking their time in the descent, not being used to such scrambling, and unwilling, I dare say, to soil their grand uniforms. "Dirk," I pressed, "see here. It's under the water. You dive and come up. It's all dark." But he only grinned bitterly at me, still holding his ankle. "Then see," I cried in desperation, and running dived into the pool, and rising in the cave waited a full 2 minutes before returning. I climbed back to Dirk and said, "See? Am I puffed? I tell you." But now he had grasped my meaning. "Come," he said excitedly. "Show me." I pointed to the spot, and limping to the edge, he dived. He didn't reappear, and hiding my clothes, for I didn't want the runners to have them, I plunged after Dirk and rose almost beside him in the weedy water. "This way," I said, and swam for the side, and soon we were both clinging there, blowing vigorously. Between gasps he told me of his adventures, and I heard how the smugglers had been surprised. Their sentry had been seized and gagged, and so they hadn't been warned of the king's frigate which had appeared off the coast. Someone had betrayed them. "Not my dad," I said. "No, not him, laddie," said Dirk. "He gave us the first warning, but it was too late." "Where is he?" I asked. "Oh, he's vanished." "Yes," I said, trusting my father's resources at evasion. It was some while later when we heard voices in the cave, and I showed Dirk the cranny where he might peep through. Suddenly he uttered a great oath. "What?" I whispered. "Shh!" Then came a tremendous echoing crash and the sound of cheering. When all was quiet again, he told me. He had seen the king's man, the fellow who had betrayed them. "And it was right what I was told," he said. "He had a burn across his hand, sonny. But it wasn't your dad," he added as I gave a little cry. "I saw his face, and he showed them the gates and how they worked. Blast him." "How do they work?" I asked. "They'll never work no more," was all he answered. It was some days before the coast was clear, and all the while I carried food surreptitiously to Dirk, stuffing it into the cranny from Ebb Tide Cave. My father had quite established himself with the runners when I first arrived back at the inn. I told him my secret, and he patted me affectionately on the head. "Always make friends, Tommy," he said. But he only ventured once down to Ebb Tide Cave, and that was with a party of runners who went to superintend the destruction of the old haunt. I went too, and saw the great gates wide. The 2 rocks had been perfectly balanced against each other, and as one sank down into the earth, it drew the other up into the roof by a stout steel cable. It was while I was with Dirk that the runners had hacked the cable through, and the huge half of rock that should have been poised above had crashed down, and now lay along the passage. But the tunnel which my father had expected to find, opening into the side of the cave wall, wasn't there. And somehow I think he had lost interest in the place, for he questioned me little enough of the cave I had discovered, and he seemed uneasy too, barring our door strongly at night, and waking at the least scratch. When the runners at length gave up the search, Dirk came from his hiding place. In the distance the frigate was fading from sight. I shall never forget that gaunt, dripping figure, slowly dragging himself up the cliff because of the pain at his damaged foot, his clothes clinging to his limbs and oozing with green weed, his long hair with the pigtail all undone, drooping flat down his neck and over his sunken cheeks. The picture still haunts me in my dreams, and I see him as he climbed to a ledge of rock and slowly turned his face towards the sea, his eyes, still heavy from the long darkness, peering with evil hate at the vanishing ship that was carrying away his mates to their doom. His teeth gnashed with impotent rage, and he tottered to his feet and shook one terrible fist at the frigate, and cried a bitter curse on the spy who had betrayed his comrades. Then, laughing brokenly, he turned to me and clambered on up the cliff, saying, "But I saw him, Kitty. I know him, and I'll follow him to the end of the world. But I'll have his heart's blood." I was silent, and the giant continued his painful ascent, and breaking from a snarling mutter, he said to me, stopping on his path, "See here, Kitty, you don't know what hate means, I dessay, but it means just this. I've made my pile. I can rest and be comfortable, and have my seat by the fire and the drink at my hand, but I'll give every piece I've gathered to hunt that devil to earth. I'll get him. I'll get him." At the top of the cliff he hurled forth his last threat, as the white square sails faded into the misty air, then slowly stumbled back with me to the inn. And as I walked at his side, I thought I began to understand why one man should hunt another over the world. I knew something of the life of the hunted. Now, for the first time, I saw the hunter giving cry, and my father. But I couldn't imagine my father as a spy and a betrayer, and then the old story of the mad captain came back to me. But neither could I see my father as one who had left his men to perish all alone. What was the secret of his flight? At the inn, my father was ready for the road again. "Come, Tommy," he said. "We must tramp." I held out my hand to Dirk. "Goodbye," I said. He took my little hand in both his. "Goodbye, Kitty," he said kindly enough. "You're a good brat. You've saved my life, and maybe I'll do the same for you one day." He nodded curtly to my father and rolled into the inn. But we two plunged into the woodland and travelled far that night, and with the morning struck the highway, and begging a lift of a carter bound for market, were soon jolting along the road, fast asleep.